What if I told you that the smartest man in the room is usually the one who says the least? Not because he lacks answers, but because he understands something most people never learn. That silence is a form of power. That restraint is often more revealing than expression. That wisdom doesn't scream, it waits. Picture this. You walk into a room where decisions are being made. Voices are loud, opinions thrown like darts. Then, there's one man. Quiet, observing. He doesn't interrupt, doesn't rush to prove himself. He waits, watches, and when he finally speaks, every head turns. Not because he's loud, but because he's earned the right to be heard. That man could have been Ethan. Ethan was 27, bright, ambitious, fresh into a competitive product design role in San Francisco. He'd been given a rare opportunity to sit in on a closed-door meeting with the CEO and a team of top execs. He came in ready, energized, determined to prove he belonged. Then the CEO began explaining a new approach to collecting user data. Ethan had seen something similar in a previous job. Confidently, maybe too confidently, he cut in with a smile. I already know that. What happened next? The room paused. The CEO didn't scold him. He didn't even respond. He just nodded, moved on, and never invited Ethan back. What Ethan didn't realize was this. His words didn't make him sound competent. They made him sound closed. Closed to new angles. Closed to the wisdom in the room. Closed to growth. You see, intelligence isn't measured by how much you speak. It's measured by how deeply you listen. And the moment you say, I already know, you shut the door on everything you don't know. You miss the nuance, the unseen, the deeper layer. That's not knowledge. That's ego. The Stoics knew this long before modern psychology ever gave it a name. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor and philosopher, wrote, "Receive without pride. Let go without attachment." He understood that real strength wasn't in having all the answers, but in having the humility to keep seeking them. In today's culture, we glorify being right, being first, being loud. But truly intelligent men play a different game. They don't speak to impress. They speak to contribute. They listen more than they talk. They ask more than they answer, because they know what most don't. Silence is where understanding begins. It's not about being passive. It's about being intentional. The quiet man in the room isn't unsure. He's calculating, learning, waiting for the moment when his voice will actually move the room. And when it does, it carries weight, because it wasn't used to fill silence. It was used to create meaning. Ethan's story didn't end there. Months later, after reflecting, he realized the real lesson. He had robbed himself of a deeper insight by trying to prove he was already smart. He hadn't just cut off the CEO, he'd cut off his own opportunity to grow. So he did something radical. He started practicing silence. Literally. One day a week, he wouldn't speak in meetings unless asked. Instead, he'd take notes, ask clarifying questions, and listen without planning what to say next. And slowly, people noticed. When Ethan spoke again, they listened. Not because his title changed, but because he had. What if you tried that? Just once. A conversation where you don't rush to reply. A disagreement where you don't fight to be right. A meeting where you don't speak just to sound smart. What might you learn? Smart men know how to talk, but wise men know when to wait. If this resonates with you, if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and rooted in timeless wisdom, hit that subscribe button right now. It keeps this channel alive and gives me the motivation to keep bringing you deeper, sharper, stronger content. Let me leave you with a question, one that says more about your growth than your knowledge. Which of these is the mark of a truly intelligent man? A. Someone who always has something to say. B. Someone who knows when to remain silent. Drop your answer in the comments, A or B. I'll be reading every one. Jordan had always been the guy who made things work. the one you could count on in a crisis. At just 30, he was already a lead developer at a rising tech startup in Austin, Texas. People called him the problem solver, the fire extinguisher, the one who could turn a mess into magic. So when his CEO walked into the office one Monday morning and dropped a bomb pivot, the entire platform in 6 weeks with half the usual budget, everyone turned to him, and Jordan said what any reasonable person might say when cornered by pressure and uncertainty: "That's impossible." He didn't mean it as a challenge. It wasn't defiance. It was fatigue, fear, and the feeling of being buried before even starting to dig. But those two words echoed in his mind long after the meeting ended. Not because they were loud, but because they felt final. What Jordan didn't realize in that moment was that his words weren't describing the situation. They were describing his own limits, the truth. The obstacle wasn't the timeline or the budget. It was his perception. We all have moments like that, when something ahead of us feels so daunting that our minds lock down. It could be a career shift, healing from a breakup, asking for forgiveness, or starting something we've been too scared to admit we want. Our fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up dressed in logic, wearing the voice of reason, whispering, "Be realistic. That's not going to work. Don't even try." But what if that voice isn't wise? What if it's just familiar? The Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That single line has more truth packed into it than most motivational books. Because most of the time, we're not battling the real world. We're battling the stories we've rehearsed in our heads for years. Jordan sat alone that night in his apartment, staring at his laptop. His deadline was still impossible, the resources still minimal. But something shifted. Instead of asking, "Can this be done?" he asked, "What part can I do today?" He wrote out the first 3 actions he could take that didn't require permission, budget, or certainty. He reached out to a former colleague for advice. He mapped out a stripped-down version of the new system. He sketched out a pitch to attract 2 interns who had shown promise during their recent summer rotation. The next day, he showed up with momentum, not a miracle, but motion. And that changed everything. 6 weeks later, Jordan didn't just deliver a prototype. He inspired the entire company. They didn't launch the perfect product, but they launched something new, something they could build on, something that, only weeks earlier, felt like a dead end. Here's the point. Saying that's impossible is easy. It's safe. It gives us an out. It protects our pride from the sting of failure, but it also robs us of the chance to rise, to surprise ourselves, to shift what we believe is within our reach. The Stoics never said life would be fair or simple, but they did say we have power over one thing: our response. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Jordan found strength not in certainty, but in movement, in acting when everything in him wanted to freeze. What about you? What have you labeled impossible because it scares you? Is it the idea of starting over? Asking for help? Trying something new after a past failure? If you knew you couldn't fail, what would you attempt today? Here's a small challenge. Make an impossible list. Not a to-do list, but a list of 3 things you've told yourself are out of reach. Then take 1 micro-action toward the first one. 1 email, 1 conversation, 1 commitment. Not to finish it, just to start. Because intelligent men don't let fear write their limits. They question their fears. They challenge their doubts. They move anyway. And in doing so, they discover what Jordan discovered. Most of the time, the impossible isn't impossible. It's just unfamiliar. Nathan had always prided himself on being the kind of teacher students respected. For nearly a decade, he taught history at a high school in Chicago where he was known for his energy, creativity, and deep commitment to his students. But in the fall of his 10th year, something started to shift. His classes became harder to manage. Students were disengaged. He found himself growing frustrated, tired, and increasingly short-tempered. One morning, the projector in his classroom failed during a critical lesson. The slides he had spent hours preparing wouldn't load. Students began whispering, texting under their desks, checking out. Nathan snapped. "This isn't my fault," he said, louder than intended. "Tech support should have fixed this days ago." The words hung in the air, like smoke. No one responded. His students just looked away. That evening, Nathan couldn't stop replaying the moment. It wasn't just the malfunction. It was how quickly he distanced himself from it. In that instant, he had placed the blame elsewhere, hoping to preserve his authority. But what he really did was lose the room. The next day, a colleague who had quietly observed the class pulled Nathan aside. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes it's not about who's at fault. It's about who steps up." Her words pierced through the noise of his frustration. Nathan went home and sat with the discomfort. The truth hurt, but it was also freeing. For the first time in weeks, he stopped defending and started reflecting. When we say, "That's not my fault," what we're really doing is giving up power. Power to learn, power to influence, power to change. Blame might feel like self-protection, but it's actually self-sabotage. It puts the solution in someone else's hands. Responsibility, on the other hand, doesn't mean everything is your fault. It means you have a role in making things better. The Stoics were relentless in their focus on personal responsibility. Epictetus taught that while we cannot control what happens, we are fully responsible for how we respond. In other words, control begins with ownership. So Nathan began making changes, subtle ones. At first, he started ending each day by asking himself, where could I have responded differently? Sometimes the answers were humbling. He had to admit he hadn't prepared as well as he thought, that he had missed cues from his students, that he'd let exhaustion dictate his tone. But instead of spiraling into guilt, he used it as fuel. He met with students to ask for their honest feedback. He created backup plans for every tech-dependent lesson. And when things still went wrong, he owned it. One day another projector failed. A student groaned, expecting the usual meltdown. But this time, Nathan smiled, pulled out a whiteboard marker, and said, "Looks like we're going old school today. Let's see how fast I can draw Napoleon without embarrassing myself." The class laughed. He didn't just keep control of the room, he earned their respect. Here's the deeper truth. When you stop wasting energy proving it wasn't your fault, you gain energy to make it right. Intelligent men understand that influence doesn't come from being blameless. It comes from being accountable. This doesn't just apply to classrooms or careers. It applies to everything: relationships, health, goals. When you say, "I didn't cause this, but I can contribute to fixing it," you step into the role of creator instead of victim. Try this at the end of the week. Choose one moment where something went wrong. Ask yourself, what part of this can I own? Not for punishment, but for progress. You'll start to feel a shift, not just in results, but in confidence. Nathan's journey didn't make him perfect. He still had tough days. But now, when students drift or plans fall through, he no longer reaches for excuses. He reaches for his role in it. And that's what changes everything. Because the man who takes responsibility even for a piece of the problem is already leading the way toward a solution. And that's the kind of leadership the world actually trusts. Marcus had built his life around the idea that real men carry their own weight. As the founder of a creative agency in New York City, he had clawed his way through the chaos of competition, deadlines, and constant client demands. To everyone around him, he was the rock, steady, unshakable, the guy who always had it handled. But what no one saw was what it was costing him. He woke up every morning, exhausted, before the day even began. His inbox looked like a war zone. His team leaned on him for every final call. At home, His partner barely recognized him anymore, but every time someone asked, "Are you okay?" he smiled and said, "I'm good, I've got it." It was a lie, but it was a lie he believed, because asking for help didn't feel like an option. It felt like surrender. Then, one Thursday afternoon, Marcus collapsed. He was in the middle of a presentation, mid-sentence, when everything went white. He woke up in an emergency room under cold fluorescent lights, 4 in his arm, and panic in his chest. The doctor's words were clear: burnout, stress-related hypertension. His body had been running on fumes for months. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, Marcus faced the truth he had been running from. He wasn't invincible, and the armor he had spent years building around his pride had become a cage. The Stoics didn't define strength by how much a man could endure in silence. They defined it by how well he could live in harmony with reason and nature. And nature, they believed, made us interdependent. Marcus Aurelius himself, one of the most powerful men in history, regularly sought counsel, thanked mentors, and surrounded himself with people who challenged him. If he didn't see asking for help as weakness, why should we? After his collapse, Marcus made a decision that felt harder than any business negotiation he'd ever faced. He started opening up first, to his team. He admitted he'd been stretched too thin and needed to delegate more, then to his partner, with whom he'd barely shared anything real in months, and eventually to a therapist, where he finally said out loud, "I don't think I can do this alone anymore." Each time he reached out, he expected judgment, but what he found was support, patience, relief. The pressure didn't disappear overnight, but the weight was finally being shared. What he learned is something most men are never taught. Asking for help isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. There's a reason so many people suffer in silence. We're conditioned to see vulnerability as a crack in the armor. But the truth is, refusing to ask for help isn't about strength. It's about fear. Fear of seeming weak. Fear of losing control. Fear of being seen. But here's the paradox. The very thing we fear being seen is what frees us. Because when you ask for help, you're not giving up. You're stepping into a new kind of power. One that builds trust. One that deepens connection. One that says, "I'm strong enough to admit I can't do this alone." Marcus didn't just recover. He began to thrive. He implemented weekly wellness check-ins at work, encouraged his staff to take mental health days, and started a monthly dinner with a few close friends where the only rule was honesty, real conversations, no masks. If you're reading this and thinking about something you've been carrying alone, stop and ask yourself why. What would it cost you to open up? And more importantly, what might it save? Here's the reality. Life is hard. Even the strongest of us buckle under the weight of it sometimes. But intelligent men don't let their pride drown them. They ask, they reach, they trust, and in doing so, they rediscover their strength in a way they never knew existed. The lie is thinking you have to do it all alone. The truth is, you were never meant to. Leonard never imagined he'd be learning something new at 68, after retiring from his career in civil engineering and losing his wife of 42 years. The days began to feel long and predictable. His world had become smaller, mornings filled with quiet coffee, afternoons with reruns, and evenings drifting into silence. He told himself that this was just how life was supposed to look at his age. Slower, quieter, done. Then his granddaughter handed him a violin on his birthday. It was completely unexpected. He laughed, politely thanked her, and placed the instrument back in its case, assuming it would gather dust alongside his other unused hobbies. But later that night, alone in his room, Leonard stared at it. Not with excitement, but with hesitation. A voice in his head whispered the phrase he'd come to accept as truth over the years. "I'm too old for that." But this time, something inside him pushed back. He opened the case. At first it was uncomfortable. His fingers didn't move with the ease they once had. The sound he made was scratchy and awkward. But for the first time in years, Leonard felt alive, not because he was good, but because he was curious again. That single decision to try sparked a transformation. He enrolled in a local community class in Denver, surrounded by beginners half his age. He practiced every morning before breakfast. He began writing in a journal again, tracking progress not by how skilled he became, but by how it made him feel. And he noticed something surprising. The more he leaned into learning, the less his age felt like a limitation. It became an asset. The Stoics believed that life wasn't measured in years, but in action. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about death, not to provoke fear, but to spark urgency, to remind us that each day alive is an invitation to do something meaningful. Wisdom, the Stoics said, isn't tied to youth or old age. It's tied to willingness, to courage, to action. Leonard had spent so many years quietly shrinking his world, believing that the chapter of becoming was behind him. But the truth was, he still had time. He just needed to stop acting like he didn't. Age doesn't disqualify you, it equips you. The longer you live, the more patterns you recognize, the more stories you can tell, the more moments you can reflect on with clarity. What many call limitation is often just a different kind of strength waiting to be claimed. Leonard began volunteering at a local elementary school to help children with reading. He didn't plan to share his violin playing, but one afternoon, when the teacher asked if anyone had a talent to share, a student pointed at him. So he took a deep breath, lifted the instrument, and played. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but honestly. The room fell still, and when he finished, the kids cheered. That moment stuck with him more than any achievement from his career, because it wasn't about the music, it was about permission. The permission to evolve at any stage of life. The permission to be new at something, even when the world says you're supposed to be winding down. If you've ever caught yourself saying, "I'm too old for that," pause and ask who told you that. Was it someone else? Or was it fear in disguise? Fear of failing, fear of being laughed at, fear of not being as sharp, as quick, as agile as you once were. The truth is, most people don't regret aging. They regret not living while they still had the chance. You're never too old to try something new, to apologize, to heal, to learn, to laugh in a way you haven't in years. The clock keeps ticking no matter what. The question is whether you're going to use the time you have left as a reason to stop or a reason to begin again. Leonard chose to begin again, and because of that, he didn't just rediscover music, he rediscovered himself. You can too. Jonah had meant to call Mike for weeks. They used to be inseparable college roommates turned lifelong friends, who knew each other's stories without needing to speak them out loud. But life, as it tends to do, got busy. Jonah had a growing career in Seattle as a digital marketing manager, a newborn at home, and a to-do list that never seemed to shrink. He told himself he'd reach out when things slowed down. Next weekend? Maybe. After the next big campaign wrapped. When he had more energy, more clarity, more time. But time had its own plans. On a gray Monday morning, Jonah's phone rang. It was a mutual friend. The words didn't register at first. There'd been an accident. Mike was gone. No warning. No goodbye. Just silence. Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still in his hand, staring at nothing. And then he saw it. A text he had started drafting a week earlier. Just 2 lines. "Hey man, I miss you. Want to catch up?" He never sent it. He had planned to finish it later, when things calmed down, but later never came. In that moment, Jonah understood something he'd never fully grasped before. Life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't pause for your schedule, or your plans, or your good intentions. It just keeps moving. And every time you say, "I'll do it later," what you're really saying is, "I'm willing to risk never doing it at all." The Stoics had a word for this. Awareness, memento mori. Remember that you will die, not to create fear, but to create urgency. Because when you carry the truth of mortality in your pocket, you stop postponing the things that matter. You stop living like you have endless tomorrows. Jonah could have drowned in guilt, but instead, he made a choice. He couldn't get that moment back, but he could stop wasting the one still in front of him. He created a simple habit called Action Hour. 1 hour each day. No distractions, no multitasking, devoted to what he'd usually put off. A phone call to someone he loved, a handwritten letter, a task he kept avoiding at work. Even something as small as booking a long overdue appointment or organizing a space he'd been ignoring. What started as an act of grief became a rhythm of clarity. He began to feel lighter, not because his life got easier, but because he was no longer carrying the weight of everything undone. What we put off today rarely gets easier tomorrow. The apology doesn't get simpler. The dream doesn't wait patiently. The person we love doesn't stay frozen in time, ready for us whenever we finally show up. Later is an illusion, a comfort we cling to so we don't have to face discomfort now. The Stoics knew this well. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." It's not meant to be morbid. It's a guidepost, a mirror, a challenge. What have you been putting off? Is it a conversation you've been avoiding? A story you've been too afraid to write? A trip you've been saving for but never planned? A chance to reconnect, rebuild, or restart? Whatever it is, it's not waiting for you. And the longer you hesitate, the louder the silence becomes. Start now. Not because it's perfect timing, but because perfect timing is a myth. All you have is the moment in front of you. That's where life happens. That's where change begins. Jonah still misses Mike. He always will. But he now lives with a deeper reverence for time. He makes fewer promises to himself that start with someday. He shows up, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's uncomfortable, because he understands what too many of us learn too late. That the gap between intention and action is where regret is born. But every time you close that gap, even just a little, you reclaim your power. Today matters more than you think, more than you're told, more than you'll ever realize until it's gone. So whatever you've been meaning to do, say, or change, start now. Not all of it, just one step. The rest will follow. Ethan, Jordan, Nathan, Marcus, Leonard, Jonah, 6 men, 6 very different lives, different cities, different challenges, but one common thread that connects them all. They each faced a moment when they had to confront themselves. Ethan thought intelligence meant proving. He already knew the answer. But what he learned was that true wisdom requires listening, humility, and the willingness to be wrong. His silence became his strength. He stopped interrupting and started observing. And in that stillness, he grew not just in knowledge, but in character. Jordan stared down a challenge that seemed too big to handle. He called it impossible, as many of us do when fear and uncertainty rise. But instead of backing down, he shifted his focus from the overwhelming to the actionable. What can I do right now? That question moved him. That question rebuilt the path one step at a time, and by the end, he had not only achieved what once looked impossible, he had redefined what was possible for himself. Nathan's story reminds us that blame is the fastest way to lose control. When he shifted from finger-pointing to reflection, everything changed. His students responded to his accountability. His confidence returned not because things became easier, but because he became stronger, more grounded, more self-aware. Marcus lived in the illusion of strength for years, carrying every burden alone. But when his body finally gave out, so did his story. He learned the hard way that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. By reaching out, he rebuilt his foundation. He didn't just survive. He found a new, deeper strength rooted in connection, not control. Leonard believed his time had passed, that the life of learning, discovery, and adventure was reserved for the young. But grief became his awakening, and a single violin became his invitation back to himself. He chose to begin again, and in doing so, he discovered that age doesn't limit us, our beliefs do. And then there was Jonah. He put off a simple message, thinking he had time, but time doesn't wait. And when he lost his best friend, he was forced to confront the high cost of later. From that pain, he created a new rhythm, a daily choice to act, not delay. He now lives his life one step closer to presence, one step further from regret. These stories aren't just about these 6 men, they're about all of us. Because each of us has said those same things at some point. I already know that. That's impossible. That's not my fault. I don't need help. I'm too old for that. I'll do it later. Each phrase sounds harmless, but behind every one is a habit, a belief, a limitation we've accepted without question. What this journey shows us is that intelligent men, wise men, aren't those who never fall into those traps. They're the ones who recognize when they have, and they choose differently. So what's the deeper lesson here? It's this: growth is never a one-time decision. It's a daily practice, and it often begins in the uncomfortable space between who we are and who we're becoming. It asks us to be honest, to slow down, to listen, to act before we're ready, to own what's ours, to lean on others, to begin again, to choose now, not later. These men changed not because they were forced to, but because they were willing to challenge their ego, willing to rewrite the stories they told themselves, willing to live with more intention, more humility, and more courage. And you can too. You don't need to wait for a crisis. You don't need to collapse to realize you're tired. You don't need to lose someone to say what matters. You don't need to hit a milestone to start over. You just need to choose today. So ask yourself, which of these phrases has been holding you back? What belief have you been carrying that no longer serves you? What small, quiet change could you make that would move your life in a better direction? Let's talk about it. In your opinion, which one of these 6 men's turning points resonated with you the most? Whose story reminded you of yourself or someone you care about? Comment below with the name that hit home: Ethan, Jordan, Nathan, Marcus, Leonard, or Jonah. And if you're feeling brave, tell us why. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this message stirred something in you, if it reminded you of who you want to be, subscribe to the channel. Not for me, for you. Because every video is another opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to come back to the man you're meant to become. Let's keep walking this path together, one choice at a time.